Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the board members and guests to the Wednesday, April 27th meeting with the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency, Placer County Airport Land Use Commission, Western Placer Consolidated Transportation Services, perfect, and Placer County Local Transportation Authority. We welcome the public to in-person participation in addition to remote teleconferencing. Participation is available to board members and the public pursuant to the provisions of Government Code Section 54953 Echo. Due to the COVID-19 State of Emergency Proclamation and recommendation for social distancing, there will be multiple opportunities throughout the meeting for the public to comment. After I open an item for public comment, those joining us by webinar can signal they wish to speak by clicking the raised hand button in the middle bottom of the Zoom webinar window. If you're joining over the phone, you can press *9 and PCTPA staff will call out individuals one by one who have indicated they wish to speak. For those joining us in person, you're welcome to come to the podium. We ask that anyone making public comment state their name and city of residence. You will then have a maximum of 3 minutes to speak, and I will notify you when your 3 minutes is up. If you experience technical difficulties and are unable to provide public comment during this meeting, please email your comment to Solvi Sable, our clerk at ssabol@pctpa.net. Because the meeting is conducted via teleconference, all votes will be roll call votes. Board members we ask that you state your name prior to making a motion or seconding a motion for the record. Once an item has been moved and seconded, I will request the clerk for a roll call vote. Paul, would you like to lead us in the pledge?
You all please stand. Join me in the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call.
Baker,
Here.
Broadway,
Here.
Burris,
Here.
Dowden Calvillo,
Present.
Holmes,
He's there.
Howdeshelt, Joyner,
Here.
Jones,
Here.
Wilkins.
Present.
All right, got a full house.
Thank you. Solvi, AB 361.
AB 361 provides allowances for the board to meet with the relaxed teleconference rules due to the state of emergency and state recommendations for social distancing. The social distancing guidelines have been evaluated, and staff is asking the board to adopt findings to allow for the continued teleconference meetings.
Thank you, Solvi. Board discussion? Everybody's comfortable? All right. So we need, I guess, a public comment on this?
Chair, I did have my hand up.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to make mention that although obviously I'm in agreement with us approving this item for today, I would be in support of us not bringing this forward for future meetings and simply allowing for teleconferencing under the old Brown Act rules going forward, because I at this point, I'm under the impression that most people's teleconferencing has no longer, no more relation to COVID at this point.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, just wanted to provide one little update to the situation. Cal OSHA, their regulations are effective through May 5th, and so if those don't get renewed, it will be a kind of a moot point anyway. So we're monitoring that, but if it looks like we can't do that, we'll switch to that. And kind of the big impact on that is if we do, we can still have board members as say Supervisor Jones and Supervisor Holmes are today, we can still have that. We just have to notice the meeting where they're located at. And because our agenda packet goes out very early, there will be no flexibility in a board member changing location. So if you, for example, have the meeting, you're having the meeting from your house, we notice that it's at your house, you have to have it at your house. We can't move it to your place of business, for example. And a member of the public has to be able to access that if needed. It doesn't happen very often, but it has to be available that way. So that's the change, or that could happen. The other thing is that we plan to have the hybrid public, as we've discussed before, for the foreseeable future, because it seems like that actually promotes public participation. So we're going to at least try that until we can't do that anymore. So those are the two things that I wanted to provide some input on.
Okay, thank you.
Also, just Mr. Chair, really quickly, I know that there are two pieces of legislation that are in, I think, the Assembly Committee on Local Government right now that would permanently amend the Brown Act, that would allow us to function in this remote scenario without having to notice if we're at our home, for example. So I know that Pioneer Energy is following those pieces of legislation, and I can get the bill numbers to Solvay as well, so that we can monitor them and how they might impact us going forward.
And I apologize, I didn't mention those, and our state lobbyist, Mark Watts, is also following those very closely, as well as CalCog that we participate in. So the thing that we're trying to avoid with those two pieces of legislation is to add more onerous requirements than we already have, and that's why those things are both stuck in the legislature at this point. They were expected to move through much quicker, but the legislature took an opportunity to start adding a bunch of new things, as they commonly do. So
Can never be easy, you know? Just pass it and let's move on and do our business, but, you know, okay.
Through the chair, move approval of the item.
I'll second.
Motion and second?
Okay. Baker?
Aye.
Broadway?
Yes.
Burris?
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo?
Aye.
Holmes?
Yes.
Haudashelt? Joyner?
Yes.
Jones?
Aye.
Wilkins?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Approval of action minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move approval.
Have a motion?
Second, I have my mouth full.
Motion second.
Gotta go there and take a
Baker?
Aye.
Broadway?
Yes.
Burris?
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo?
Aye.
Holmes?
Yes.
Haudashelt? Joyner?
Yes.
Jones?
Aye.
Wilkins?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Agenda review, anybody have anything?
Where do you get the code? Yes.
staff does not have any changes to recommend either.
Perfect, thank you. We will now move to public comment. Is there anybody that has, in the public, that has a comment for something not on our agenda tonight? There's nobody. Perfect. All right, seeing none, we will move on to our consent calendar. Item G.
Second.
Baker?
Aye.
Broadway?
Yes.
Burris?
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo?
Aye.
Holmes?
Yes.
Haudashelt? Joyner?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
Wilkins?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Now move on to the consent calendar for Airport Land Use Commission.
Oh, the consent calendar.
Move approval.
Mr. Chair, we do have a public hearing item on this. We don't actually have to have a public hearing, but we have to allow the public if they wish to say something. So if you could announce that, please.
Okay. And that one is on the Placer County zoning text amendments. Is there anybody in the public that wishes to speak on this item? Perfect.
Mr. Chairman, just point of order. It's a consent item, but we have to open it up for public comment. Why don't we just make it a regular agenda item?
We could do that. It's, we worked with our legal counsel that this although is rare to have a public hearing on consent, it can be done. And have done this, probably this is about the fourth time we've done that. We could, if the council or if the agency board so choose, we could put these on as a regular public hearing.
It just makes sense to me that if we have to take the time to open it up for public comment, that it just be a regular agenda item. I recognize that legally we may be able to do that, but it also is, it's a little odd too, because I've never experienced that except for here, where you have public hearing and it's an item on consent. So if unless there's objection from my colleagues, I'd like to have these on as a regular agenda item so that when we adopt the consent calendar, we can just dispense with that and move on to regular business and not have to stop and take public comment.
We can do that.
Thank you.
Clarification, I'm not sure what you said.
So what I said was, this item is on consent.
Right.
But and generally speaking, when an item is on consent, you simply make a motion unless someone wants to remove it from consent. But we have to stop and open up public comment on an item that's on consent. Normally, we don't do that.
Actually, don't we have to have public comment on
On the entire.
consent calendar?
On
to
the
begin
entire
with?
consent calendar as a whole. But if you have 5 items on consent, you generally make a motion to approve the consent calendar second and it's dispensed with. Actually, you will have public comment and opportunity for discussion after the motion and second.
So do you want it
But-
to stay on consent, or do you want it to
I want
be
to
a
make it
separate
a
item?
regular agenda item because we are stopping and asking for public comment anyway on that item. That way we can dispense with our consent calendar without having to stop and do it midway.
If it's on consent, and the public can comment on consent, then they can comment on asking it to be removed. So
But we have
that's
to-
where my
Yeah.
that's where my confusion lies.
We don't just have to wait for public, we have to take this up as a separate item anyway, because we have to open the public hearing. So regardless of whether or not there's a person here to speak to it, we have to stop and open up the public hearing, because it is on consent. So if it's a regular agenda item, we just simply open the hearing, we close it, and we vote on it. But that way, if we have 4 items on consent, we don't have to vote on each item on consent, we can just dispense with it.
So a public hearing is a formal process that has to be opened and closed. It's different than simply taking public comment.
Understand that, somebody wants to remove it from consent, so that, okay. Now, I have not watched enough Law and Order shows to weigh in on this, okay?
All right, so we do not have any public comment on this item. What does the board want to do?
I'll move approval of this item.
Second.
Baker.
Aye.
Broadway.
Yes.
Burris.
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo.
Aye.
Holmes.
Aye.
Howdeshelt. Joyner.
Yes.
Jones.
Aye.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Mike Lucan, consideration of the April 22 polling results.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Board of Directors. The item you have before you today is the consideration of our polling results for the potential 2022 transportation sales tax measure. I would note that this item is a item of the not of PCTPA. It is a item of the Placer County Local Transportation Authority, which is the separate entity that was created by the Board of Supervisors a number of years ago prior to the 2016 Measure M to act separately as an authority on issues related to sales tax. So this is not the PCTPA board, it's the PCTPA board acting as in the capacity as the PCLTA. The other interesting aspect of this item is that due to the timing of the polling that was done and the normal course of our getting out our agenda packet 2 weeks in advance of the meeting, we had to put this out with the options to actually move forward for a 2022 election. However, our recommendation is going to be different today than what is in the report. So, to start off, the transportation sales tax measure for the South District is a critical item that has been in our wheelhouse, if you will, since approximately 2013. We've been considering looking at a sales tax measure. Initially, it was a countywide approach. And we did put Measure M on the ballot in 2016. That measure failed by a mere 2 percentage points. Based upon that occurrence, the board directed us to pursue a district approach, which at the time was not allowed by state law. We sought a bill in the legislature, Assembly Bill 1413, which was passed, which allowed the 3 counties of Solano, Sacramento, or San Diego County, and Placer County to, if you will, on a pilot basis, look at creating these sub-districts for sales tax purposes. That pilot does not expire, so it is a 3-county pilot in perpetuity until that legislation or that code is changed. So with that in mind, we began the pursuit of a sales tax measure for the south part of the county, and so we looked at the communities of Lincoln, Rockland, Roseville, and Loomis, and we looked at those, have looked at those several times, and based upon polling, we have eliminated Loomis now twice, prior in 2020, and then here in the last year, based upon those polling results. We also took a second look at a countywide measure in 2019, and again, polling results basically from Newcastle eastward do not lend themselves to a sales tax measure, as polling was in the ranged anywhere from the 30% all the way up to the high 50s, so which would not support a measure. And that's really because, as we've surmised, most of the improvements that are needed in the county are in the south part of the county. Most of the sales tax that is generated in the county is generated in the south part of the county, and so residents and businesses in those other areas, we think felt that it was not for them, and so they did not respond positively. So. So we've taken a couple attempts at this. One prior to the pandemic, or right as the pandemic started. We had to delay that because of the pandemic. We then restarted about a year ago, and then also faced a couple of variants of the pandemic, and had to kind of start and stop our outreach approach to the public to educate them on the measure. Based upon those, we then restarted in earnest in January with a very aggressive outreach strategy, which got us to where we are at today. And so we have Kurt Balo here to present the polling results, and also Cherry Spriggs and Aldo Panesci here today to also discuss the measure and the effort. And I'm pretty sure we have a number of people from our stakeholder group and other individuals, not only in the audience today, but also online, that also want to speak to the status of where we are at. In conclusion, and we will get to this during the course of the presentation, but the bottom line is that we are moving in a positive direction. We got to 67%, which is the 2/3 required. However, as you'll see in Kurt's presentation, it's a soft 67%, and we are not going to recommend moving forward in 2022. But staff is going to recommend that we choose a course to examine a 2024 measure. Lastly, I'll just respond in saying that we have a strategic deficit in transportation funding, so there is no alternative to this. Our general plans in the south part of the county, our specific plans, and the development projects that are associated with those plans depend on us finding a solution to finding a local match for funding. And so without this, Without that, we will not be successful. We will not be able to pursue any funding under the new federal infrastructure bill, because that and state funding to be competitive requires a 50% match, and we simply don't have it. So with that, I will turn it over to Kurt, who is on the Zoom, and he'll go through the latest polling results.
All right, thank you, Mike. Good morning, everybody, and happy to present these survey results. I think, Mike, and if you want to clarify, just I think a longer deck may have been included in the materials. What I'm going through here is slightly truncated just to kind of get us to the more strategic conversation at the end. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, Mike.
Yes, Kurt is correct, and apologies for not mentioning that. You have the full slide deck in your on your dais and received that by email. But for time's sake for this meeting, we're gonna go through most of that, but not all of that. But you have the full demographic analysis and everything else that was done in the polling. So.
Yeah, and by truncated, it's still 40 some odd slides, but I will try to still get through it
Instead of 60 or 70, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so just a quick note about methodology. We've done the same survey methodology for you a number of times before, but I think the main things here are we conducted these interviews in the middle of April. So these are pretty fresh polling results, looking at voters who are likely to vote in this November's election. So and that second to bottom row is the margin of sampling error. So keep that in mind for questions asked of the full sample. We have a 4% margin of sampling error. For those of a half sample, it's around 6%. So those 4 and 6 numbers are probably the most important to keep in mind. All right, so the first section here is how do the voters that we surveyed view life in the county, and particularly traffic issues? So here is the old Gallup question, which we've obviously asked a number of times now, right direction, wrong track. You will see a steady decline in the right direction numbers. Wrong track numbers are ticking up a little bit too. This is just in the 3 Roseville, Rockland, and Lincoln cities, but this is not a uncommon trend. Frankly, we're seeing this absolutely everywhere. There's just a lot more anywhere from outright pessimism to just a little more anxiety about the direction of government and communities, federal, state, and local levels. So this is not a surprising finding, although still, just about half still feel like the county is headed in the right direction, just not quite as optimistic as in prior years. Now, these are the questions that I think are particularly important to consider. So we presented a pretty long list of different problems that could be facing the area there in South Placer. And we asked respondents to indicate, well, how serious of a problem do you think it is? And what we're really looking for here is, where does traffic congestion stack up as a problem compared to everything else? And how about some of those economic concerns? Where are those? Because those obviously have ramifications for willingness to support a revenue measure or a tax measure. So the scale we used here is extremely, very, somewhat, or not too serious of a problem. We look at the more intense reactions, the extremely, very serious problems, which we summarize on the right-hand side. And as you'll see, there's a top 2 here. And these were things that kind of weren't on our radar 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, as things have changed quite quickly in our world these days. Inflation and gas prices, where just about half of respondents said those were extremely serious problems, and about 3/4 said they were at least a very serious problem. So these are 2 things that weren't top of mind concerns for even us to even include in the survey question last go round. We added it in here, and wow, they really are on top of the list. Similarly, the conflict in Ukraine, while a big international situation has had local ramifications on some of these things, we added that to this question, and it's in the top series of items as well. And many of these things are issues that have little to do with the transportation tax, but we want to see, like, well, where's the drought? Where's homelessness? Where do those stack up with traffic congestion on local freeways and highways? And as you see here towards the bottom of this first slide here, here's where we have traffic congestion on local freeways and highways. So 53% of voters feel like that's an extremely very serious problem. No one's really dismissing it. That dark blue bar is only 9%. So a lot of people feel like it's at least a somewhat serious problem. But in terms of intensity, it is well below a number of these other issues, many of which deal with economic issues. The second slide in the series, or 2 slides, we asked about a lot of items here. Traffic congestion on local streets, that's typically been a little bit lower. We'll also look at the amount you pay in local taxes in the middle here, because that is obviously what we're talking about here, a local tax. And 41% feel like that is an extremely very serious problem, which is a little bit of an indicator for us to pay attention to. In terms of reductions in state and federal funding for transportation, not seen as a problem. Potholes, not seen as much of a problem either in these 3 cities. The other item I want to highlight here is jobs and unemployment. While you see some of these economic things about inflation, cost of housing, gas prices at the top of the list, that is different from bigger issues around employment, where very few voters are particularly concerned about that. Many of these we've asked in the past, not all of them, and so we put some tracking here, and it's a ton of data to absorb. What we sorted this by in the right-hand column is just a change from the last survey we conducted in the end of last year to now. So which of these things have had material changes? You'll see quality of public education, crime, homelessness, they've all jumped up in terms of people's levels of concern. And if you'll notice here, something like traffic congestion on local streets, kind of about the same amount you pay in federal state taxes, kind of about the same. But on the next slide here is where you see traffic congestion on local freeways and highways, and you'll get a little bit of a feel for where that's been in the past. So beginning of 2019, beginning of 2020, pre-pandemic, kind of around 2/3 of voters who said that is an extremely or very serious problem, putting it very close, if not at the top of concerns that we asked about. It dropped down during the pandemic, which was understandable. The survey we conducted at the end of last year, we saw it pick up a little bit to 58%, and we were thinking, okay, maybe it is becoming a more salient problem and becoming more pressing on the minds of residents and voters. And then we conducted this survey, and in between we had the Omicron variant, and whether that's an impact or not, it's come back down to 53%, which is actually the lowest point it's been since we've been asking about it in October of 2017. So this is traffic congestion, freeways and highways, is just not the same level, same point of pain as it's been in the past. We've asked a question about, do you feel like traffic's gotten better or worse or stayed the same in recent years? We've had to adjust it a few times to accommodate the pandemic. So once we asked in the middle of it, and then we asked about how's it been like putting aside the stay-at-home orders, and then more recently we've asked, trying to think about traffic prior to the pandemic, do you think it's better or worse or about the same? And that's obviously a trickier thing for someone to think through and remember a couple of years in the past, but it gives us a little feel for, do people have a gut feeling that traffic's getting better or worse? And you'll see again, pre-pandemic, solid majority, 7 out of 10 were just like, it's getting worse. And many thought that it's getting much worse. So again, it was a much higher ranked problem prior to the pandemic starting. And it was also seen as something that was trending in the wrong direction. So now we asked, is it getting better, about worse, about the same since before the pandemic? It is. There seems to be a feeling that traffic is getting worse, because that worst number has gone from 38 to 46 to 50. But it's still a far cry from the sort of inevitability of it that we saw in prior surveys. And also one thing to note here is that the much worse numbers haven't changed that much. It's more that somewhat worse. So while there's a feeling that traffic's gotten worse a little bit since the pandemic started, beginning of it, it's not an intensely held feeling. Well, this is more a perspective question. So a couple of years ago, we decided, well, let's flip this and not just look retrospectively or right now. Let's ask people in the future, a couple of years from now, how do you think traffic's going to be, better or worse? Well, here everyone thinks it's going to be worse. In the throes of the two more serious pandemic summers of 2020 and 2021, it was still seen as bad, but now we're in the 70, basically 3/4 feel like it is going to be worse 2 years from now. So we're at the situation where traffic is maybe seen as a little bit worse than it was before the pandemic, but it's far down the list of concerns compared to other things. Although there is this looming feeling that at some point in the near future, it is going to continue to get worse. We did ask this question, a new one, at the survey we asked at the end of last year, which was, well, how much of an impact does traffic have on your quality of life? And the numbers didn't change basically at all, which is 64% feel like it has a negative impact on people's quality of life. And kind of when you're looking at some of these, keep in mind 2/3 threshold. So not a little less than 2/3 of the respondents to this survey feel like traffic has a negative impact on their personal quality of life. And the intensity of that is not all that strong. So about 1 in 5 feel like it has a very negative impact on their quality of life. So again, this is another interesting indicator to watch in the future. We have asked a couple of various times over the course as some economic questions. And one we've asked here the last couple of times, which is, well, do you think your personal finances will be getting better or worse? Because what you frankly, for the prospects of a measure passing, you would like to see, or not like to see, but voters feeling more concerned about traffic, but not any more concerned about their personal finances. We thought this might be trending more in the negative direction, but it's kind of held steady from the end of last year, where a majority, a little more than half, feel like, yeah, things will be about the same, with somewhat similar numbers, feeling more pessimistic than optimistic, but not a strongly held opinion there. So that number hasn't changed much. All right. Next section is pretty quick. We just asked some favorability questions about different levels of agencies here. So we asked about the Board of Supervisors. Blue bars are shades of favorability. Those mustardy type bars are shades of unfavorability, and gray is either I can't rate them, I don't know, or maybe I've never even heard of them, which is sort of strange, but you had a bunch of folks here who said they never heard of the Board of Supervisors. You'll see the favorability numbers have kind of been in the same range since a couple of years ago, kind of oscillating in that 40% range, and the unfavorable numbers are sort of around a quarter. Not a big change in opinions there, although the board was viewed more favorably in early 2020 and prior. In terms of the PCTPA, we've seen the more variety here in some of these changes, where the favorability numbers were frankly picking up as we got closer to potentially putting something on the ballot in 2020. There was more outreach and communication and anticipating a potential ballot measure, and we saw some of the impacts of that. And obviously there's been a lot of disruption, and communications have been put on the back burner and put back, you've gone on and off engaging in communications with the pandemic, and these favorability numbers have kind of settled back down a lower level. We also asked about the 3 cities, and this is just kind of helpful to know how the cities are viewed, because they'll obviously be involved in placing something on a ballot here. Lincoln, those numbers have held about steady after sort of recovering from a bit of a nadir in the early 2020 years. Not quite the same high points of 2017 though. Rockland, a little bit of a decline there in favorability numbers for Rockland city government overall, but not dramatic. Kind of hovering in that 60 to 70 range. And Roseville, again, holding pretty steady for the last couple of data points that we had as well, around 70%, although it's still a little bit lower than sort of the beginnings of the pandemic. All right, let's get to the measure itself. And Mike gave us a little bit of a sneak preview here. Half-cent sales tax for 30 years, raising about $41 million. And here were those reactions to it. So as a reminder of how we structure these questions, we either read them on the phone to somebody who took the survey on the phone, or someone took the survey online, they read it themselves. And we said, would you vote yes or no? If you said yes or no, we pushed you a little bit, said definitely or probably yes, to get a feeling for that intensity. And then if your initial reaction was to be undecided, we then asked the follow-up question, well, are you leaning one way or another? It gives us a 7-point sort of spectrum here. Now, as you see here, hey, if you include all those who are leaning yes, that gets us to 67% yes, and 31% no, with very few undecided voters. These types of measures are pretty easy to understand. There's not a lot of indecision on them. People get what a sales tax is, and because it's very specific about how the funds will be spent, there's not a lot of confusion about that either. If you think about people's gut reaction first, before we push those leaders, we're about 64% yes. And we're hovering right around the vote threshold for a measure of this nature. I'll talk about the historical context in a moment here. There are more detailed demographic breakouts in the full packet materials, but in terms of ones that were kind of salient here are more about lining up attitudes about traffic in the economy, things of that nature, and support for a measure. So if you feel like traffic since the pandemic has gotten much worse, your support is at 72%. And if you see that, well, I think it's kind of about the same-ish, well, that's only 62%. So there's some correlation there. If you feel like traffic is going to be much worse 2 years from now, again, you're at 72%. If you feel like, yeah, it might be a little worse or might stay the same, just a little bit below 2/3. Similarly, that financial outlook number. You remember a lot of folks were in that stayed the same category. They're actually a little bit over 2/3. The optimists about their own personal finances were particularly bullish on a measure at 77%, but that quarter of the electorate who's feeling a little more uncertain or pessimistic about their own personal financial outlook, their support was way down at 57%. So you see here that perceptions about traffic and personal finances definitely have an impact on support for a measure, and particularly when something is so close to a 2/3 threshold, even little changes in perceptions about traffic and personal finances can really make or break a measure's success. The only other demographic I'm going to go over today is just
from time to time based on meter data that Trinity described, or just some kind of anomaly with their voter generation where it's not behaving the same all of a sudden.
I have to apologize. I didn't quite totally hear. Is that a question? I didn't totally hear it. I was a little garbled.
No, Kurt, that was a noise in someone's background, so go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right, good. Because I didn't, if it was a question, I didn't understand it. So I will go on. All right, so by geography, you'll see Lincoln. We've consistently seen Lincoln voters a little more supportive. Roseville voters are actually pretty similar now, and they're right around or above 2/3. Rockland trailing a little bit at 62%. And then by the four different districts that we represent here, you see support kind of varying between low 70s to low 60s. All right, and then our final section here is, well, to go through some pro and con arguments, what's the impact of those? So we start off at 67%. And if at the initial support. So we go through some pros and some cons, and we rotated the order of those. So half the respondents heard statements saying you should vote yes on the measure, half, and then reasons to vote no, and the other half heard it the opposite. Hey, you should vote no on this measure, and then heard reasons to vote yes. After hearing both sets of arguments, support dropped to 52%. As we'll see when I show some historical context, that's been the case every time. But it just suggests there's a lot of volatility here, and support is somewhat soft. So here's the high point and low point. So for half of the respondents, if they only heard positives, you'll notice, oh, Holland, that is my background noise. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, I am at home.
K9 input, yes. Yeah.
All right. So you'll see that we didn't go up after positives only. We start off at 67% out the gate, and then went through some arguments and ways, things of that nature, and support actually dropped a tiny bit. The intensity went up a little bit, which is unusual for what we've seen in the past. If we start off with just criticisms, negatives, support really flipped dramatically. And this slide here is probably one of the most important to look at here, which is just the historical context. So the bottom of this table is survey research we conducted leading up to Measure M. And it's just a mental note here. The last survey that was conducted prior to placing Measure M on the ballot was in February of 2016. And support was only at 63%. And after positives, it still only got to 63% and then dropped to 53%, but ultimately ended up at 64%, which is right around where that high water mark kind of was. There was a couple surveys we did in 17 and 19 with a slightly different geographic configuration, but as we sort of zeroed in on the 3 cities here, you see that support has been in that same low to mid 60s range in the initial vote. And then for the first time, up to 67%, which is really encouraging. But you'll notice in the subsequent 2 columns that the vote after positives only actually is pretty low. It fell down oddly at 63%, and after pros and cons is sort of where we were at the end of the survey, at the end of last year as well. So I think this is kind of helpful context here, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the presentation. So if you look at this by vote consistency, another indication here is we've got a little less than half of respondents who said they'd vote yes every single time. But only a little more than a quarter who said they vote no every time. So this is there's not like a third who are always saying no, and there's not like 60% are always saying yes, but there's a full quarter here who are changing their opinions or are consistently undecided. That's a pretty small group in this regard. And if you're going for a 2/3 measure, you'd like to see that consistent yes, try to get to about 50% so that you're not trying to convince as many people to support a measure. So what are those pro and con arguments? It's a lot of text here. It's in the packet, but you'll notice that the top ones here, and we'll break them out in a second, are mostly about just traffic or in specific improvements that the measures would fund. We do talk about the matching funds, which Mike referenced in terms of the ability to tap into state and federal funding. To talk about some other things that at different points of time have been more salient about, we got to address traffic to make emergency response more smooth. We talked about the quality of life impacts. We talked about we got to really take control of our own financial and security here at the self-reliance argument. And what we did for each of these is we went through and said, well, how convincing of an argument is this? And if you could say it was very or somewhat convincing. You could also say it was not convincing or you don't believe it. We're just not showing that data here. But you'll see there was kind of a tiering here where 3 arguments got to at least 70% in terms of being convincing, or at least a third or more very convincing. And that one right below the first dashed red line is not that far off, just because the intensity is at 34%, but it's specific to improvements to 80 and 65, and broadly, traffic's bad, we got to do something about it. Those seem to be the most compelling rationales. If you look down towards the bottom, and it's not perfect sorting here, but we talk about, well, if the impacts on your quality of life and how we don't want to become like the Bay Area, and the connection to jobs, it felt like, for lack of a better word, calling them more soft rationales, maybe indirect rationales. Those seem to be just a lot less compelling. It's really specific. Traffic's bad. This will just address it, and here are the specific ways that we're going to. And some of those matching funds types of things were kind of somewhere in the middle. In terms of rationales to oppose a measure, the gas tax has always been at the top of the list and continues to be. We talked about, hey, this is really a problem of too much unchecked growth. Developers should be paying more for this. And the 4th item here is sort of blurring some of the facts here, which is basically like there's all this money, federal and state sloshing around. We don't need this. It's a little bit ignoring the fact that matching funds are needed, but it's the type of criticism that somebody could wage. Also talking about we just have too many taxes and about the uncertainty of the future here. Using that same scale, there were 4 rationales that were most compelling reasons to oppose the measure, and the gas tax is always the top of the list. But then those next 3 are, hey, this growth has been going on unchecked, should have been planned for. In that same vein, this growth should be paid for, the developers should be paying for this. And then also this concept that there's all this money out there that's available, why do we have to tax ourselves? So in terms of sort of key takeaways here, in terms of the election, just the context itself, 53% say traffic is either an extremely or very serious problem. And that's down from where it's been in the past. In terms of top most concerning issues, you got inflation, and right nestled up next to it is gas prices. So like these economic issues, and you see there's a 20-point plus difference there in terms of the intensity with which people are worried about pocketbook issues versus traffic. And then in terms of, well, what kind of an impact does traffic have on people's quality of life? In the southern part of the county here, a solid majority say it's bad for my quality of life, but only about 1 in 5 feel like it's particularly intensely negative. So big picture here, traffic is getting worse a little bit now. You're starting to see that trend a little bit. And most assume it's really going to be worse a few years from now. But in terms of ranking with other issues, it has fallen down the list. So that doesn't mean that they're not seeing traffic as a problem, but other things are just leapfrogging it. And it's a lot of these economic cost of living issues. So what does this mean for a potential measure here? Hey, initial reactions to the ballot language were the highest we've seen in a number of years, 67%, which is right at that 2/3 vote threshold. So that's encouraging. But when we went through arguments in favor of the measure, support actually dropped down a little bit. Margin of sampling error at 4%. It's not a huge difference, but it's a little bit shocking that we're at least not holding ground there. And then we come in with negatives, we drop way down to 52%. So a pretty precipitous decline there. So while we're at the higher starting point, and it's it's a really good place to be starting from, getting below 2/3 is challenging here. So there's a couple of things I just want to add to this end of this presentation, just as for context. Here is that red line is the percentage of voters who feel like traffic congestion on local freeways and highways is an extremely or very serious problem. And you'll see the first 4 data points, particularly the 2019 and the 2 early 2020 ones, are right before we hit the pandemic. We're hovering around 2/3, feel like, wow, this is an extremely or very serious problem. It drops down when we're in the first summer of the pandemic, and we've been hovering in that 50 range. And if anything, we're at the lowest point that we've seen in a long time. Those last 3 data points are newish items. A couple of them we haven't been tracking at all, but we just put them on here as a comparison point of, whereas we had around 2/3 feel like it was a very serious problem, traffic that is, which is around the vote threshold, which kind of is where you want to be. It's below that, and these other items are just seen as more pressing. Similarly, that vote, gosh, look at that 67% in the initial vote. That's as highest we've seen since the beginning of 2020. So that seems great. But as soon as we went through pros and cons, we dropped down to almost the lowest point that we've seen. So as Mike said, that 67 we should be encouraged by that, but it is soft. And there's a lot more volatility here than we've seen in the past. And that probably has to do with the fact that traffic congestion is just not seen as pressing of a problem. And there's so many other things, particularly economic things and pocketbook issues that are above it. So this kind of summarizes everything I just went through here. But it feels like getting to 2/3 this November would be very, very challenging. And if this dynamic of inflation, gas prices, housing, all these different things that affect people's personal finances still are seen as far more pressing problems than traffic congestion, then that feels like a really challenging position to be in, to put something on the ballot this November. So with that, unless there's something that would really disrupt that dynamic, it seems like a really challenging position to be in right now. I think that wraps it up for me, Mike.
Thank you, Kurt. Are there any questions on the survey itself before we go into the rest of our team?
Yeah, just a basic question. So there were 615 surveys. Did the responses mirror the percentage of voters? You had a slide there that showed Rockland was 26% of the voters, Lincoln 20, Roseville 54%.
Yeah, yes, they do mirror the populations of the
So
cities.
So
And they also-
54% of the responses, or 332 responses, were from Roseville?
Yeah, I'll let Kurt elaborate
Yeah.
a little bit more on that. We also do survey high propensity voters, so this is not a survey of the general public, if you will. It's a survey of high propensity voters. But Kurt, why don't you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah, Mike, you said it exactly right. So this is we look at the voters in those three cities, and then we do a model based upon their past voting histories, who's likely to vote in November gubernatorial election. So it's the ratios are a little bit different than the general population, but we created that electoral model, and then we conducted interviews to reflect those same proportions.
So in general, we do, quite a bit more in Roseville based upon its population, and then about the
Exactly.
same in Rockland and Lincoln. So, all right. Well, next then we have Cherry Spriggs and Alda Panesci, who are on our FSB team, to make a couple comments.
Hello, members of the PCTPA board, Chair Baker. How are you guys doing today? I always look forward to this time before you for sure. Hi, Kurt. Nice to see you. I just wanted to thank the FM3 team for another comprehensive and informative research program. I don't know if you all saw Kurt's opening slide, but we were out in the field on April 16th. So that was the last day we were in the field, so they got it wrapped up pretty quickly. So a few remarks on this round of research. We achieved the 67%. That's certainly something to celebrate for sure. But as you've heard today, it's soft, it's very soft. So at this point, coupled with everything that's going on in our world, we recommend that this body do not move forward with the 2022 election at this time. But there were a few key things that I wanted to point out. With every research effort that Kurt's team puts together for us, we end up, just gleaning such tremendous insight, and I wanted to talk to you about a few of these things. So, first of all, we know that there needs to be two things at play for something like this to pass, right? And so that's people viewing this as a high priority, but then also experiencing the being and the congestion, right? So if you don't have one without the other, it's tough to get people to vote for something like this. So what I do think, though, is positive is that we see from the numbers that the increase, if you were thinking, wow, there's a lot of traffic here, I'm getting sick of this, people are more likely to support this. So I think that that's a positive step in the right direction as we look for the next 2 years. When you look at the historical data that we get from this too, it's also important as it relates to our program and how we run our program and how we refine our program. As Mike has once said, it's a sprint or a marathon, and I think it's safe to say we're in the middle of a marathon, right? I'm looking at Ken here because I know he's a runner, so he certainly gets that. So I think we look at this soft 67 and we gain the knowledge that we have for this and look forward to 2024 as we, work with this program and adjust our program. And Aldo and Mike and myself have been working on that to see what we're going to do for the next year. So with that being said, I really do just think it gives us an excellent point of reference for the future. So with that, I'll take any questions. No?
Anybody have any questions with you? All right.
Yeah, just,
Okay.
Great.
So the phraseology of the question includes the word tax.
Mm-hmm.
Has it ever been surveyed as a dollar amount?
No, we have not done that in this instance. There is a lot, when we talk about in our messaging, we do talk about it as a dollar amount. And I'll let Kurt take this because I know he has the right terminology for it, but as it relates to what we do on our ballot language, there's certain things that need to be in the ballot language legally.
Sure.
And so we don't do the dollar amount, we do
know.
tax. Kurt, did I handle that okay? Or do you have anything more to add with that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. A few years ago, AB 195 was passed, and you have to include the tax rate in the 75 words, the amount it generates on an annual basis, and the duration, and those three things have to be in there. So I think it's conceivable you could include an estimate, and haven't seen this done, of how much it might cost the average resident, but you would still need to include the tax rate itself in the 75 words, is my understanding. And I'm not an attorney, so I'm maybe in front of my skis here.
We do have our legal counsel on the phone, if you'd like a response from Deanne Gillick.
No, I think that's adequate. I mean, if you're going to tell me that it's going to cost me $35 to $50 a year, I can budget for that. But if you're going to say tax, it feels a lot more. It's an emotional response, right?
And you are completely right in that regard, and that I think was something that we learned out of doing the outreach from 2014, and then transitioning to being the team that worked on the private campaign. When Aldo and I would be out doing the outreach, right, we talk about the tax and what it was, and we talk about, okay, at that point now we talk about what it would cost, right? We know roughly $65 for a family of 4 a year, or whatever that looks like. But at the time, for a multitude of reasons, that wasn't discussed during the campaign. And I remember distinctly Aldo and I being with somebody who thought it was going to cost them $2,000 a year. So I get what you're saying for sure.
Yeah. Well, as we move forward, we'll research that a little more about what we can and can't do, and we'll certainly work with Deanne to make sure we're within the legal bounds of what we can and can't do. So.
Thank you.
No, nothing else? All right. Thank you guys so
Thank
much.
you.
I appreciate it.
All right. Any other comments from board? Mike?
Just before I know we have some public comment here, but just wanted to emphasize that our recommendation is actually recommended action 3 in the staff report. So what we're saying is if polling is inconclusive at this time, to support a 2022 measure, direct staff to continue its outreach strategy as proposed in the preliminary 2023 OWP for a potential 2024 ballot. So just that will be staff's recommendation before we get into the public comment. So
Thank you. Bruce, did you have
One more question, Mr. Chairman. The measure is a multimodal measure, is it not?
it is, yes.
So it is not just a roadway measure?
No, our expenditure plan, which we have developed, and we actually went out. I did not mention that we went out again countywide and did 14 community workshops to make sure the expenditure plan was what our residents and businesses wanted. That expenditure plan did not change from what it did before, which it has about 2/3 of the cost is for roadways. But about 1/3 of that cost is for transit and bike ped modes. So we have a substantial amount in there for those two modes, and also for rail as well. So.
Thank you. All right, we will open it up to public comment.
Hello, Anthony Hernandez. I was the former chair of the campaign for Measure M. Not that long ago, and as you heard, 2% still hurts. But coming here before you today with the numbers there, I think Kurt did a great job. You all understand the monumental effort it is to run a campaign, as you've all run as elected officials. Running on an idea is even harder, and especially when you're asking people to dig into their own pockets, it's a significant challenge. And I think what you saw in the numbers there We have a significant issue with traffic here. People know that. But unfortunately, there's the dark clouds on the horizon with inflation and other things. The 4 of your top 7 issues there are all cost issues for people's pocketbooks, and asking them to dig into their pocketbooks even more and to pay makes it a significant challenge for us. So with that, I understand the recommendation and fully supportive of that. That monumental task is tough. And so getting people to reach into their pockets and give so that we can forward that message to them, to craft the message to them so that they understand what they're getting is a significant challenge. And we want to make sure that it's effective and it's successful. So with that, completely support the recommendation that you've heard today. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer them if you need them.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Willie Duncan, the Superintendent President at Sierra College. It's a pleasure to be with you talking today. We've been engaged with PCTPA staff over the last few years, looking at projects, looking at roadways around the college. And so I thought I'd come and make some public comment today. First, I just wanted to stress how important this tax measure is to the college and to the community. As the college is coming out of the pandemic, we're starting to get our enrollment coming back on campus, and we're starting to see some of that traffic return. And so thinking about the 80 interchange and that area and how students get to and from the college, I think is going to be really important in the future as we come out of this even further. And then also thinking about the new Placer Center. We're in partnership with Sac State on that center, and that's obviously going to have an impact on roadways and traffic getting to and from that center. Education, is we're essentially a workforce training engine for the community, and so I think it's imperative that people have the ability to get to and from our centers and our locations. And then just to add a little bit of context, the college passed a bond measure in 2018. We did a lot of work leading up to that, and we were polling at about 62% leading into the election. We only needed 55% on that particular measure. We got 55% plus some nickels added in. I think it was 600 votes literally that the bond measure passed by. So there was definitely some leakage that occurred between our last polling and the election. I don't know if you can align an education bond measure to a transportation situation like this, but it does make me a little concerned hearing the staff report about a soft 67. I would hope we would come into this much firmer. So I would just express my opinion that I would agree with the staff recommendation that you hold off and wait till 2024. And that purely comes from the perspective of wanting this to pass. So for the importance for the college. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else in the audience wish to speak? All right, seeing none, we will take it to the phones.
John Tallman, you're free to speak.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Baker, members of the board. My name is John Tallman. I'm with West Park Communities in Roseville. We've been involved in the transportation sales tax since back when Measure M first came around. We've committed time and financial resources because we strongly believe that traffic and the impacts on quality of life are too important to ignore in Placer County. We also recognize that our state and federal partners are shirking their responsibilities when it comes to dealing with transportation issues. We are strong supporters of a sales tax measure. We would very much like to see it on a ballot as soon as possible. There are always going to be risks. There are always going to be reasons why we shouldn't go. But here in 2022, the headwinds are quite strong through inflation, folks' concerns about gas tax, just general economic issues, the war in Ukraine. We just have a lot of things that are likely to upset a well-run campaign. And when we have to go to ask folks for significant contributions, we have to be sure we have a reasonable chance. And for the reasons that have been explained today by others, I recommend, or I support staff's recommendation to you to not move forward in 2022, but keep the education process going, educate our Placer County residents as to how transportation funding works, and hopefully in 24 we'll have another opportunity. Thank you for your time today.
Peter Eklund, you're free to speak.
Yes, thank you. My name is Peter Eklund. I'm a Rockland resident, and I'm generally a supporter of the bond issue whenever it appears to be reasonable to submit to the voters. I have a couple specific comments. I think the survey was quite good, but I think over time there's some other things that need to be talked about. First of all, multimodal was mentioned. It needs to be mentioned. It's a third of the budget. It needs to be mentioned. I think there's a reluctance to put in because people might not favor multimodal, but I think some of the negative might be because there isn't multimodal in there. So I think that needs to be looked at. The other thing is I think the survey needs to talk about a longer time period. The bond issue, as I understand it, is going to go for 15 years, and a lot of projects can't be done within a two-year period. So I think the survey should go to 10 years at least, so people understand that projects take a long time to develop, and we're looking at a long-term bonding issue. The other thing that's important is to make sure that taxpayers realize that the bond issue is for specific projects. You can't, I think there's not necessarily a strong trust in governments to handle money wisely, but these have to go for the projects that are in the thing. The other thing I think is to mention, I didn't think the cons were very good. I think some of it was kind of a scare tactic, hyperbole. I think developers are paying for some of the projects, and also there's an apple and orange issue. There's some things that the county can control and some they can't. A lot of the issues on there are things they can't control, and I think that it's important to recognize that the county can control this. There's lots of safety measures to make sure that the money is well spent. And finally, I think the best time to do planning and to get projects ready is when they're just, at a time exactly like this, so that when they are needed, the projects are ready to go to construction. And I guess the final thing is the bond issue leverages funds. The county doesn't have to pay for everything. It can leverage state and federal money, and that is so important. And I think these things somehow need to be incorporated into the survey so that there's a better understanding of how this funding process is different than most other funding projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you for the presentation. I always find it interesting seeing polling numbers, especially when it brings in a larger aspect of things. And I saw a report yesterday of consumer confidence is actually lower than it was in 2008 currently. So I think that there's a lot of economic indicators to show holding off, in my opinion. Conversational board?
Mr. Chairman, I had one really quick question. You had mentioned that we're in a hole right now, and that we're not going to be able to apply for the is it the ARPA funds for the transportation?
No, it's our main two sources of funding are state transportation funds from various sources, and then the federal source is the new infrastructure bills, the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and then there's a kind of on the horizon some version of what was formerly known as Build Back Better.
Okay, those. Okay.
Yeah, and the law still says you can apply for those funds with somewhere between 12 and 20% of matching funds, but the problem is competitiveness, that when we go up against our other fellow agencies, either in the state or in the nation, they're coming there with 50%, and we we just don't get the money. We can apply all day, but we can't get the money without half, so.
So just moving forward, I would hope that when we, are working towards 2024, that we incorporate that kind of language in the surveying. I mean, because I think that's very important, that we're unable to compete for those federal monies that our taxpayers are entitled to. And that's frustrating, and I'm sure it's frustrating for all of our taxpayers, that those monies are there, they passed them, and then we can't even benefit from them. And so to maybe incorporate that language moving forward. Mr. Chairman and members, I agree with staff's recommendation on this. This support is incredibly soft. It's amazing to see that it came in at 67%, but when you start talking about the pros, it actually slides down to 63%. And then when you introduce the arguments into it, it's all the way down to 52%. So truly now is not the time to pursue this measure, but I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us, and I will be supporting staff's recommendation at this point.
Ken?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and great comment that you led us off with, the discussion that when you look at consumer sentiment, it's definitely a concern. I think keeping Placer moving is not going away. We have a lot of work to do, but failure is not an option either. And pursuing something where we know we're not going to be successful. It's just like coaching softball. When I set my players out, they got 3 strikes, and after that, they were done. They came back. Well, we can't afford to put this out there again and fail. But what we can do is continue to work aggressively to keep our focus and look at 24 and how can we be successful in 24. Because again, we have to keep Placer moving, and we're only going to do that by being successful in securing this tax measure in 24. So I look forward to the team's efforts as we continue to work towards that and support staff's recommendation that we do shift our focus to look at 24. So thank you.
Do you guys have anything?
Sure. I'll just say that I agree with my colleagues. We've been looking at this long and hard for many years. This is definitely a marathon at this point.
It's an ultra.
It's an ultra marathon, yeah.
It is.
So I think what happens for most people is that there comes a point where you have to accept that there is no alternative. There is no way around this. If we want to solve this problem, this is the path. And a lot of folks aren't quite there yet, unfortunately. You can see the numbers in Lincoln. I think they are there. We're kind of at the end of the line, most impacted by all the traffic. So we'll continue to do the work to push the information out there so that people can come to the conclusion that I think most of us inevitably will. I'm going to support staff's recommendation as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's appropriate. We're in the endurance capital of California, are we not? So we're running an ultra marathon here. Mr. Hernandez, thank you. It's painful when you emotionally invest and work hard and you have the result, right? So thank you for that. Mr. Duncan, thank you. We all want to be a little Pollyannish about this, don't we? We really want this, because it's vital. And we're always a little cautionary that, 2 years from now, we might or might not be, the sentiment of the voters might or might not be better. So, but given that and given the comments of my colleagues, boy, it's really murky waters ahead here. You just look at yesterday's, the R word is starting to creep into the dialogue, and there's too many unexpected. So I appreciate the empirical data and the analysis, and like my colleagues, I'm in support of staff's recommendation.
Thank you. I do think on a messaging side, for as we move forward, transportation funding is going to be changing dramatically in the state of California over the next number of years. 2035, they're saying no more gas-powered vehicles being sold. So on a long-term funding strategy for roads, it's going to have to implement into a sales tax side of it regardless. Because right now the roads technically are funded a lot through that sales tax. So as the gas becomes less, that deficit gets further and further, and we're going to have some bridges to build further down the line. But I do think that that's going to be important, that we look at the long-term funding strategies, especially here in South Placer. So,
Mr. Chair, I believe we may want to ask Trinity and Jones and Supervisor Holmes as well.
thank you. Trinity.
Thank you, Chair Baker. You captured what I was going to actually speak on pretty well there. And I would like to echo your sentiments and those of my fellow board members. You know, I support staff's recommendation here with great sadness at this point. This is work that needs to get done, and you need to pay to get work done, and we're going to need to find a solution, and this is very clearly it. But as Paul said, people just aren't quite there and convinced yet, and we can't strike out 3 times, to Ken's point. So thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Holmes, Supervisor Jones, do you guys have anything to add?
No, I agree with all the comments, and I've gone over that the presentation prior to today's meeting, and so I agree with everybody's comments, and I just moved that we approve the staff recommendation.
Perfect.
And I will chime in just to say that I agree. We can't be seen as striking out, with every election and garner a reputation that, the electorate isn't in favor. Hopefully more communication. I think there were a lot of points made as far as how to phrase this moving into the future to try to garner more support. And but right now, with the uncertainty going on at the federal level, everything is costing us more money, no matter what we buy, where we go. So I am also in full support, and as a matter of fact, I will second Supervisor Holmes' motion.
Perfect.
We also
Thank you.
have Director Wilkins.
Oh, Director Wilkins, do you have anything?
I don't have any additional comments. I'm in agreement that timing's not right now.
Thank you. All right, so we have a motion and a second.
Ew. Baker?
Aye.
Broadway?
Yes.
Burris?
Aye.
Dowden Calvillo? Holmes?
Aye.
Howdeschelt?
Aye.
Joyner?
Aye.
Jones?
Aye.
Wilkins?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody's hard work in this. I know that this is not an easy task, so we look forward to continuing that work. Moving on to item J, fiscal year 21-22 overall work program budget, amendment number 2.
Yes.
Jody and Director Lucan.
Good morning, Chair and members of the board. Being brought to your consideration today is the second amendment of the overall work program and budget. It was prepared with the latest known information on work activities and fiscal changes since the Amendment 1 was passed in November of 2021. And I'm going to go over just some highlights of those changes. Staffing levels remain the same. However, there were some adjustments to billable hours, primarily due to staffing changes that have occurred since the Amendment 1 was adopted. And on the expenditure of direct costs, there were some changes there as well, mostly in work element 44, which is the State Route 49 sidewalk gap closure that are being pushed into the 22-23 fiscal year. And the revenues for those have also been adjusted since it's on a reimbursement basis. And additionally, what you'll see a surplus of $172,000, which is related to Work Element 61 or the Regional Transportation Funding Program, and I am going to let Mike talk about that.
Yes, normally we present to you a balanced budget, but in this case there is a surplus, and there's a unique unique aspect to that surplus, and that surplus are dollars that the cities and the county provided us specifically for the funding strategy. So we're recommending that you keep that in place in what we term a surplus, and then what we'll do is we'll put it into basically fund balance for the upcoming budget. So you'll see a transfer of that into the final budget, which will be before you next month. So that's, and we had to do that because those funds are restricted for that purpose. We couldn't simply put those into our other general budget. So we had to take this kind of unique approach this time. And we've reviewed that with our auditor to make sure that we're in compliance with all auditing requirements, and it does pass that muster. So,
Thank you. Any questions of the board?
Yeah. Yeah, just one quick question. In the information item, it says the cautious approach is due in part to some changes in the collection of revenue from sales tax pools that may be coming soon. Is that a positive or a negative, or debit or a credit, or?
that is a negative, and that is we would have been projecting a higher increase in our LTF, but as HDL Strategies, our sales tax consultant, told us a few meetings ago, one of the largest taxpayers in the county, and we're not allowed to name them specifically because of privacy requirements, but they overpaid. And at some point, they're going to have to be refunded, not by local jurisdictions, but by the state. And so that will reduce that increase to us as a transportation agency, but to all entities that receive sales tax in the county. So that's why we took this kind of cautious approach, because we know that refund is coming. So,
Thank you. Any other questions of board? We'll open it up for public comment.
Peter Eklund, you're free to speak.
No, I don't have a question. I forgot to lower my hand, but I'm sorry.
No problem. Thank you. All right. Supervisor Holmes, Supervisor Jones, Trinity, do you guys have anything to add to this?
I have nothing.
And Dan?
Nothing. Thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah, I don't have anything. Thank you.
Thank you.
Move approval.
Motion second.
Baker.
Aye.
Broadway.
Yes.
Burris.
Yes.
Dowden Calvillo. Holmes.
Yes.
Howdeshelt.
Yes.
Joyner.
Yes.
Jones.
Yes.
Wilkins.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Moving on to Director Lucan.
Yes, under the executive director's report, I have just a few things to report out. One is we are working with a number of you to get ready for our cap-to-cap trip, which is a very important activity to go back to Washington, D.C., even in these trying times with traveling and being in the region for activities that have happened back there. But we have a number of folks that are going, Director Baker, Director Broadway, Director Burris, and Director Howdeshelt are all attending from our PCTPA board. Director Baker, Director Broadway, and are on the transportation team. Director Burris is on the air quality team, and I'm sorry, Director Howdeshelt, I don't know which, is a free agent, so he's going to help everyone. So we have really great coverage there. I did want to say one really good thing that is normally with these we get pretty significant appointments on Capitol Hill and with agencies. But this time we got an extraordinary meeting with the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration, and that may seem kind of in the weeds in terms of that meeting, but that is a vital project to the Third Track project. And so it's unique that we get this appointment. Unfortunately, it happened very late in the trip, and so But fortunately, Director Houdeschelt is going to be back there. It's late on Wednesday afternoon after Cap to Cap concludes. But both Director Houdeschelt, who also serves on the CCJPA board, and then Yolo County Supervisor and the CCJPA Chair Don Saylor will also be joining us. So the three of us and Sante Esposito, our lobbyist, will be making that trip over to FRA for a very, very important meeting. Another very, very important meeting that's happening, well, potentially happening, it's not for sure yet, but it's funny. So you have we're meeting with the deputy administrator, which for grants and that type of thing is actually probably more important. But we also may have the actual administrator of FRA actually here in Roseville that same day. It's not a for sure thing, but City Manager Dom Casey with the City of Roseville and actually our Deputy Director Rick Carter will potentially meet with FRA Administrator Amit Bose in Roseville, again with the focus on showing him our interest in FRA funding and working with the FRA program. That will be a regional tour of which we may be the last stop. But I would say it's probably about a 30% chance it's going to happen. But there's a 100% chance of the deputy administrator meeting with us. So that's what's happening on the FRA front. Did want to mention that we've had a couple other really important meetings of late. We hosted the City of Rockland and PCTPA and Local Laborers 185 hosted a joint meeting of the CTC, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and the CAR board in Rockland a couple weeks ago. That's very, very important that those meetings happen in our community. It shows our interest, and we were able to feature the City of Rockland's Rockland Road interchange as part of that event. And then we also were able to follow up that event with meetings with CTC Commissioner Jay Bradshaw, actually right after the meeting. And then yesterday we were able to meet with our hometown, if you will, CTC Commissioner John Rocco Davis at his offices in Sacramento. So two very, very important meetings that we had. A couple other just general things to mention is the City of Roseville was successful at getting a Caltrans planning grant application to do a comprehensive operational analysis for their transit system. And so as we start the short-range transit planning process led by Mike Costa on our staff, Roseville is also going to be taking a look at its entire transit system and looking at a revamp of its entire transit program, which is vitally important as we come out of the pandemic and the impacts that we had before the pandemic. So that's very, very good news that we're going to be able to do that. And likely PCT, our other big transit provider here in the county, is going to be taking hopefully a similar approach in addition to participating in the short-range transit planning process. We're also working very feverishly on some grant applications for the fall for the SB1 competitive program. We brought this to you a number of times, but focusing in on the third track project, both in its first phase here in Roseville and in its second phase along Business 80. And then the third project in that tranche of projects that we will submit will be improvements to the Sacramento Intermodal Station. So we've been working with our partners at the City of Sacramento, Caltrans, and CCJPA on that very large grant application package that we will probably submit in the fall or early next year. And we have a number of staff working on that. Deputy Director Rick Carter, Mike Costa, and David Melko, and myself, all four of us are working on that because it is so important to our funding program. Lastly, just wanted to mention that also related to the CTC, we're going to be having some projects on the CTC calendar for June, and so we'll be working with CTC Commissioner Davis and CTC staff on those. And those are items related to Highway 49, a change in schedule and budget, if you will. We are about to get the 80 Ox Lane project ready for listing, so it's about to go into construction. And it will happen between the 22 and 2024 elections. So we're confident that we can get that in there before the potential 2024 election. And then we also have a funding item that funds our agency called PPM, which provides funding to our agency for regular activities. Those three items are on the CTC calendar, and a very, very important milestone to make with all three. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions from those joining us via the Zoom? Okay. Perfect. Board direction to staff. Anybody have any? Oh, do we public comment on the executive director's report? None. Okay, seeing none, we will move on to board direction to staff. Does anybody have anything?
Just want to thank our executive director for spending his birthday with us. Wish you a happy birthday, Mike.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Since we're on the topic of celebratory things, I just wanted to. I'll let Director Baker talk about that. So never mind. He'll handle that.
We have to say some big thank yous to some heavy lifters. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. Today is Administrative Assistance Day, and Solvi and Jody work so tirelessly for us. I know Solvi gets a lot of phone calls from me. So I appreciate them and all the hard work that they do behind the scenes for us. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yep. Exactly. It's great.
I get soda, I get donuts, I'm good.
Oh, man. All right. There's some informational items. And if nobody has anything else, we will adjourn.
Thank you.